Welcome! In this training session for Lighthouse Mission Ministries, we'll go over the culture of poverty, including the causes of cyclical poverty, how poverty expresses itself in today's homeless crisis, and what you can do as a concerned individual. First, what immediately comes to mind when you think about the word poverty? Is it hunger, homelessness, illness, or joblessness? What if I told you that poverty extends beyond material needs? What if I told you that poverty could look like depression, loneliness, an abusive relationship, or even mental illness? For the longest time, we've misunderstood poverty to simply mean that someone is lacking material items such as food, housing, or income. But it's so much more than that. While the needs do factor into poverty and are often the easiest to see and address, they only tell you a fraction of a person's story. These things point to the poverty of circumstance, but there are two other spheres of poverty: the poverty of community and the poverty of spirit. Take a second to consider what you think the poverty of community might be and what that could mean for a person. It's quite different from the poverty of circumstance. The poverty of community is the lack of belonging to a support network like friends and family. Think about it. If you lost your job in your home today, what's the first thing you would do? You might call up a friend to see if you could stay with them, or maybe ask to borrow money from a family member. Your first reaction is to call on your community because your loved ones can be a safety net in troubling times. When someone loses their community, they also lose their safety net. The loss of poverty of community can vary greatly. It can look like a death in the family or a divorce or separation. It can look like moving to a new area where you can't readily access help or someone fleeing from their abuser. Whatever the case may be, the poverty of community is when we lose the healthy people in our lives who are willing to be there for us when times are tough. Now let's move on to the poverty of spirit. Take a second to think what that could mean and what it could look like for an individual suffering from it. The poverty of spirit is the fundamental loss of knowing who you are and your place in the world around you. We could easily rename this the poverty of identity. The poverty of spirit isn't just not being a Christian or not believing in God. It can actually look like someone with a lack of purpose, self-worth, or dignity. It can even manifest itself as hopelessness and despair, someone who's given up on ever getting out of their current situation. It can look like emotional instability or having anger issues. It can even include mental illness like depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, or schizophrenia. Because the form of poverty exists solely in the mind, it is much more difficult to identify. Now that we've defined the three types of poverty, let's talk about the relationship between them. These three types of poverty don't exist in a vacuum, because if they did, we'd easily solve the poverty of circumstance by allocating more money to affordable housing. But to make a lasting impact, we also have to address the psychological aspects of the poverty of spirit and the relational aspects of the poverty of community. Poverty works like a cycle where one form leads into the other, and it usually starts with the poverty of community. When you lose your community, you lose your safety net, and any circumstantial difficulties that you face alone can start your path down the cycle. This is escalated when someone loses their community in a traumatic way, like a death or a divorce. The event can radically change the way they can take care of themselves and can lead to substance abuse or other unhealthy coping mechanisms to fill the void in that lost relationship. If you're unable or unwilling to take care of yourself to this degree, you might not be eating right, not sleeping enough, not showering, and you might even become homeless at this point. Spend enough time in this and you'll start to question some things about your life, like, what did I do to deserve this? Is there any way out of this situation? Or maybe God is punishing me. These are all extremely common things I've personally heard while serving on the streets, and they indicate when circumstantial poverty is leading to the poverty of spirit. You start feeling down about yourself as dignity is being chipped away at you on a daily basis, and next thing you know, someone in the poverty of spirit begins to hate themselves or the world or both. At this point, the cycle of poverty resets when that person who's hurting relationally, circumstantially, and spiritually then goes to find a new community. It's natural to long for a community that understands what you're going through, and it's typically less than healthy people who have also been hurt like you have. And so the cycle resets. When someone re-enters the poverty of community by associating with a new community that's downgraded from their original community, it ends up not looking like a cycle of poverty, but rather a downward spiral. This understanding of how poverty works explains how one could start off living in a safe, loving home and end up years later struggling on the streets. It's important to see how poverty works in this way because in order to solve poverty, we need to look at the problem beyond the surface level. In the end, the true definition of poverty isn't that we have people living on the streets, jobless, or struggling with addiction and mental illness. Poverty is a byproduct of loneliness through broken trust and lost relationships. The true enemy isn't poverty. The real problem is the lack of healthy community and a lack of trust that cuts people off from being able to reverse the cycle. Think about it this way. Have you ever known someone who's refused to go see a doctor when they were sick or hurt? Have you ever invited someone to church and got turned down? Or advised someone to call the police when they needed help, but they refused? What were their reasons? People's reasons may vary, but it might be the same reason why homeless individuals often resist coming to a shelter like the Lighthouse Mission or other recovery programs. They have a hard time trusting these institutions. These trust issues can stem from misinformation, paranoia, or hearing other people's negative stories. Over time, the cycle of poverty and the amounts of bridges they burned has diminished their ability to trust anyone. The causes for homelessness for each individual can and will wildly differ, but the common denominator is that they've all lost the ability to trust. And without that trust, it doesn't matter how great our programs are, because without trust, any solution we offer will be turned down, just like the people who already turn away medical help, police help, or even social services help. This is the main reason why at Lighthouse Mission we believe that the only approach that can undo the cycle of poverty is a relational approach. We do this by providing needs at all three levels of poverty. We provide support in a person's poverty of spirit through encouragement, prayer, and counseling services. We provide support in their poverty of circumstance by providing tangible acts of service like offering meals and a place to sleep each night. And finally, we provide support in their poverty of community through friendship. We want homeless individuals to know that they are loved, welcome, and cared for. Consider the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15. The son demands his inheritance, cuts ties with his family, blows all his money, and finds himself in a famine where he can no longer take care of himself, and then becomes despaired and loses his identity to where he thinks he's no longer his father's son and tries to regain a form of his old community, but downgraded as a servant when he tries to come home. But what does the father do when his son returns? He embraces him and puts a ring on his finger and clothes him and puts a feast with the best possible food on and affirms his identity of his son who was lost but now is found. Imagine if the father chose only to alleviate one or two of those poverties instead of all three. Imagine if the father decided to welcome him home but didn't feed and clothe him. Imagine if he chose to welcome him as a servant and did feed and clothe him, but he didn't recognize him as his son anymore. Either of these alternate endings would be considered cruel. When we don't lift people up in all three forms of poverty, at worst they can be cruel, and at best we keep people stuck in the cycle of poverty. That's why it's important when working in this field that you keep in mind ways that you or the Lighthouse Mission can alleviate each form of poverty in some way. The cycle of poverty means that someone is experiencing all three types of poverty at the same time, but that doesn't mean that the most obvious form of poverty is their primary concern. While someone may be homeless and without shelter, their immediate concern could actually be a death in their family or an identity crisis. Because we are taking a relational approach with our ministry, we want to talk with people to uncover the underlying issues they're facing and identify their primary crisis of poverty. It takes a lot of discovery questions and a lot of listening, but eventually, as trust and friendship grows over time, you'll learn what the main poverty that person is currently experiencing. When that happens, your job isn't to solve it. This is where a lot of us get frustrated and even leave the field. We feel powerless or overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems we see others facing. But by using the cycle of poverty model, once we've identified someone's primary crisis, we can predict where it might lead and understand where it stemmed from. With this understanding, we can help prevent someone from self-medicating with drugs to cope with their poverty of community, or help them process the circumstances that led to their poverty of spirit. We can continue building that relationship until trust is at a point where the individual is willing and able to accept the right help. I know this all sounds like an exhaustive and complicated process, but know that there is no shortcut when it comes to working with the homeless population. For some, it may take months, and for others, years or even decades before they're ready to accept help. But for the thousands of no's you'll receive, the one yes will make it worth it. We all have nuanced stories and troubled pasts, but we can't fix poverty with a blanket, one-size-fits-all solution. It takes getting to the heart of human suffering, which is different for everyone, and it takes someone who cares enough to sit down and listen to undo the cycle of poverty. Thanks for watching. I hope this video was helpful for you in preparing for service in the field of homeless ministry. If you have any questions about the content in this video, please contact Lighthouse Mission Ministries.